I have peace of mind.
Right.
I have self-awareness and self-acceptance because some people like me, most people don't, and I'm fine with that.
Paul Heyman is a genius, but to some WWE stars, he was the worst man to trust. In April 2020, WWE released a large group of wrestlers during the early weeks of the pandemic. Gallows and Karl Anderson were on that list. Both men had just signed rich 5-year contracts. They believed Heyman was fighting for them behind the scenes. AJ Styles, their close friend, later said he uncovered a very different story once he started asking questions backstage. Styles claimed Heyman had personally promised the pair he was protecting their spots on Raw, while a very different account was forming out of sight. Styles did not stay quiet about what he found. He attacked Heyman's honesty in public and said harsh things about his character that spread through the wrestling world. That split between public support and private survival shapes every case here. So use the hype feature and give this video some hype as the pattern starts to show. This was not the first time Heyman's word had been questioned. It was simply the loudest. For years, performers close to him had wondered whether his praise on camera matched his choices when nobody was watching. Some found out the hard way that it did not. Heyman built his reputation as a man who could make anyone look important. He gave voices to the voiceless and turned ordinary wrestlers into stars. That gift is real, and nobody in wrestling denies it. But behind that gift sits a harder question. What happens to the performers Heyman chooses not to protect? What happens when protecting them threatens his own position? This video looks closely at 9 cases, involving 10 different wrestlers, where Heyman doubted, sidelined, or quietly abandoned people who trusted him. Some of these stories are painful to hear. Some are simply hard-nosed business decisions. All of them come from a career built on knowing exactly who to lift and who to leave behind. This is not a story about a villain twirling a mustache. It is a story about survival, and about what survival can cost the people standing nearby. Was Heyman truly protecting talent, protecting WWE, or protecting only himself? Heyman earned his reputation the hard way. On screen, he has been called the Wise Man, the Advocate, and the Oracle. Each of those names points to the same idea. Heyman is supposed to see greatness before anyone else does, and then he sells it to the world with his voice. He has often said his job is to hide a performer's weaknesses while making their strengths impossible to ignore. That sounds like a simple trick, but it takes real skill. Heyman spent years mastering it, first in a small promotion, then inside the biggest wrestling company on the planet. Those two worlds gave him very different amounts of power. In Extreme Championship Wrestling, Heyman was the owner and the booker. If he believed in a wrestler, nobody could overrule him. He could build entire storylines around one performer's strengths and hide their flaws, using managers, run-ins, and carefully chosen matches. He paired the fast-talking Bill Alfonso with Sabu and Rob Van Dam, so neither man had to rely on speaking to connect with the crowd. He used quick run-ins to turn a limited performer like 911 into a genuine crowd favorite, without ever asking him to carry a long match on his own. His word was final, because there was nobody above him to argue with. WWE offered no such freedom. Vince McMahon held the final say on almost every creative decision, and Heyman had to work inside that structure like everyone else. A mid-card wrestler who lost McMahon's interest could become politically expensive to defend. Heyman had influence, but influence is not the same as control. Inside a corporate writing room, ideas were sometimes described as coming from wherever McMahon's mood happened to point that particular day, and everyone else, Heyman included, had to work around that reality. Protecting one performer could mean spending goodwill that Heyman needed to protect his access to far bigger stars. So every choice carried a hidden cost that ECW never forced him to consider. This difference explains much of what follows. When Heyman had full power, his protection could last for years. When he did not, that protection could disappear overnight, sometimes without any warning to the performer standing in the middle of it. There is also a deeper problem hiding inside his own philosophy. When a promoter hides a performer's weaknesses instead of helping fix them, the performer can become dependent on that shelter rather than growing beyond it. Take the shelter away, and the same weaknesses that were once invisible suddenly become the entire story, playing out in front of a national audience with nowhere left to hide. Heyman has always insisted that this hiding of weakness was simply good storytelling, a craft he was proud of, but craft and loyalty are not always the same thing when the cameras stop rolling. That trap sits quietly underneath almost every case that follows in this video, shaping outcomes even when nobody says it out loud on screen. Before looking at the 9 main cases, it helps to understand why so many wrestlers already doubted Heyman's promises long before WWE ever came into the picture. That doubt began in ECW, the small but influential promotion Heyman built from almost nothing. Shane Douglas, one of ECW's biggest stars and a multi-time world champion, was reportedly owed more than $80,000 in back pay. before he finally walked away from the company. Sid Vicious, one of the biggest attractions ECW ever booked, dealt with checks that bounced more than once during his time there. On more than one occasion, he simply did not show up to a scheduled event, a quiet form of protest against being paid late or not being paid at all. Tommy Dreamer gave more to ECW than almost anyone connected to the promotion. He put his own money into keeping the company alive during its leanest years, and handled daily responsibilities that had nothing to do with wrestling in the ring, all without proper payment for that extra unseen work. Even Chris Jericho, long before he became a global star, ran into this same pattern early in his career. Together, these stories built a clear pattern long before any of the 9 main cases below ever began. At number 9 on this list is the Sandman, and his story shows the limits of what ECW's protective system could actually accomplish once it left home. He was a beer-drinking, cigarette-smoking brawler whose entrance to Enter Sandman by Metallica turned into one of the most electric moments in ECW history, night after night. Fans loved him completely, and Heyman built plenty of television time around that raw connection between performer and crowd. But behind the presentation, Heyman reportedly held real doubts about the Sandman's in-ring ability, viewing him as a limited, one-dimensional performer whose entire act depended almost entirely on the wild ECW crowd surrounding him. When ECW finally closed in 2001, Heyman advised WWE against signing him, warning that his chaotic, unpredictable style would never translate to a more controlled, family-friendly mainstream product. WWE eventually gave the Sandman a chance anyway, and his run there seemed to prove parts of Heyman's warning correct almost immediately. He lost his signature entrance music entirely because of licensing issues outside anyone's control. He was placed into short, tightly structured matches that rarely lasted more than a few minutes at a time. Producers reportedly had to remind him more than once not to end his segments too quickly, a habit built from years of working inside a very different, looser style of storytelling. He has spoken openly about feeling isolated during that stretch, cut off from the freewheeling world that made him a star in the first place. None of this means Heyman's read on his in-ring limitations was entirely wrong or unfair. The criticism here is simpler than that. Heyman had spent years building the Sandman into one of ECW's most recognizable faces, then walked away from advocating for him the moment his usefulness inside that one specific system quietly ran out for good. It is worth remembering just how important the Sandman had once been to the promotion's identity. His entrance became a signature moment of every ECW pay-per-view, the kind of pop that told television executives the promotion had something no other company could offer. Heyman used that reaction constantly while it served the product, building entire shows around the roar that greeted him walking to the ring. Yet the same booker who leaned on that reaction never seemed to invest in helping the Sandman grow beyond it. There was no attempt to broaden his in-ring skill set, no long-term plan to prepare him for a life outside the specific bubble that made him a star. When the bubble burst with ECW's closure, the Sandman was left to face a much bigger company, almost entirely on the strength of a persona that only made sense inside a building full of fans who already loved him. WWE's audience did not have that same history, and the gap between the two environments proved very difficult to close. At number 8 is Rob Van Dam, and this case is more complicated than most, because the partnership genuinely worked in many ways for a very long time. Heyman clearly recognized Van Dam's popularity, his strong merchandise sales, and his one-of-a-kind, high-flying athletic style that no one else in the promotion could match. Van Dam held the ECW Television Championship for roughly 700 days, and Heyman made that secondary title feel almost as important as the World Championship itself, through smart booking and constant, confident presentation. Yet despite that popularity, Heyman never gave Van Dam the ECW World Heavyweight Championship during the promotion's most successful and financially important years. The research behind this video treats that decision as deliberate rather than accidental or simply overlooked. More traditional, dependable performers such as Shane Douglas, Taz, and Mike Awesome remained closer to the top of the card, while Van Dam's laid-back attitude and non-traditional personality may have made Heyman reluctant to build the entire promotion's future around him alone. It is worth saying clearly that Van Dam eventually did become a genuine world champion, holding both the WWE and ECW titles at once in 2006, years after the original ECW had already closed its doors for good. That later success does not erase the earlier ceiling that existed above him for so long. Heyman trusted Van Van Dam to sell tickets, move merchandise, and elevate a secondary title into something that mattered to fans. He simply never trusted him enough to hand him the promotion's single defining position, while it still mattered most to the company's survival. This is not a story about Heyman disliking Van Dam or doubting his talent. It is a story about calculated limits placed on a performer that almost everyone else already believed in completely. Van Dam's style relied on high spots, flexibility, and a laid-back charisma that felt closer to a surfer than a traditional wrestling champion, and that difference seemed to matter to Heyman more than fans at the time ever realized. ECW had built its reputation partly on hardcore violence and partly on a family of unconventional characters, and Heyman appeared to worry that handing the top title to someone so far outside the traditional mold might weaken the promotion's credibility with a portion of its audience. Instead, he split the difference cleverly, giving Van Dam enough spotlight to remain one of the most popular figures on the roster, while keeping the title picture anchored around performers who looked and sounded like conventional main event stars. It worked commercially for years, and Van Dam never publicly complained about the arrangement at the time, which makes the ceiling easy to miss unless you look closely at the actual title history. Only with distance does the pattern become obvious. A wrestler capable of selling out buildings on his own was never given the one prize that would have confirmed it fully, at least not until the promotion that built him no longer existed in its original form. Fans debating this today still split into two camps: those who see smart, protective booking, and those who see a missed chance that only time corrected. At number 7 is Matt Morgan, a 7-foot performer whose sheer size alone made him look like a guaranteed future main event star. In late 2003, Heyman placed Morgan on Team Lesnar for Survivor Series, presenting him alongside Nathan Jones as a pair of unstoppable physical threats heading into the match. Morgan looked the part completely on paper, but his inexperience showed once the bell rang, and the team's loss at that event seemed to cool the company's enthusiasm for him almost overnight afterward. When Morgan returned to WWE television in 2005, the creative direction surrounding him had changed completely from what came before. He was given a stuttering gimmick reportedly created by Vince McMahon himself, built around the strange idea of placing an obvious verbal weakness on a man who otherwise looked flawless and physically imposing to everyone watching. Morgan has since said that McMahon had once considered a similar idea for a young Brock Lesnar, which shows this was less a personal attack aimed at Morgan and more a recurring pattern in how the company sometimes handled its biggest, most physically dominant men. Morgan tried to make the character work despite how restrictive it clearly felt to him, and for a while he found himself supporting Carlito rather than headlining anything of his own on the card. He was released from WWE in July 2005, his early promise never fully realized. Heyman did not invent the stuttering gimmick himself, and it would be unfair to place that particular blame on him directly. The real criticism is about timing and follow-through, rather than authorship. Morgan was once selected as a major physical prospect under Heyman's presentation on Team Lesnar, but that early support never grew into lasting advocacy once the company's excitement faded, and a strange new creative direction quickly took its place instead. It is worth noting how quickly the office's mood shifted around him. Wrestlers who lose a high-profile match early in their WWE run are sometimes given time to rebuild, especially when the physical tools are as obvious as Morgan's clearly were. That patience never fully arrived for him. Instead of a rebuilding period focused on his strengths, he returned to television with a gimmick that highlighted an entirely different kind of weakness, one that had nothing to do with his in-ring ability at all. Heyman, who had been so vocal about presenting Morgan as an unstoppable force only a short time earlier, was no longer positioned to protect him from that creative shift once the SmackDown landscape moved on without him. The result was a talented big man who never got the sustained push his size and look seemed to promise. From the very beginning of his run, he went on to find steady success in other promotions later in his career, a reminder that the WWE run alone does not tell the full story of his ability. At number 6 is Heidenreich, whose short run alongside Heyman produced one of the strangest and most uncomfortable chapters on this entire list. Heyman formed an on-screen connection with him in 2004, trying to present him as a dangerous, powerful threat capable of standing across the ring from The Undertaker himself. Instead, the story veered into unusual territory almost immediately after it began. Heidenreich delivered strange poetry segments that confused much of the watching audience, and he was placed into a deeply controversial angle involving announcer Michael Cole, reportedly inspired by ideas that came directly from Vince McMahon rather than from Heyman. Heidenreich was pushed into a high-profile feud with The Undertaker before he had built the experience needed to carry that kind of pressure on national television. The storyline leaned directly on his real-life discomfort with enclosed spaces by placing him inside a casket match, a detail meant to heighten the drama for viewers watching at home, without much regard for how it felt to him personally. His inexperience experience showed clearly under that spotlight, and the sheer weight of the role visibly pressed down on him throughout the feud. The partnership with Heyman ended quietly not long after the Undertaker feud concluded, and Heidenreich was moved into a lighter, less serious babyface role, before eventually leaving the company altogether within a short period of time. The main criticism here is not that Heyman personally created the strange creative ideas surrounding Heidenreich during this run. It is that he helped place an unprepared, inexperienced performer inside a high-pressure spotlight that magnified every single weakness, instead of shielding him from it, the exact opposite of the protective role Heyman is normally known for providing his talent. The Undertaker feud should have been the biggest opportunity of Heidenreich's career, the kind of rub that has launched plenty of other wrestlers into long-term stardom over the years. Instead, it became a cautionary tale about pushing a performer past his actual readiness, simply because the physical package looked promising on paper. Heyman's role as his on-screen manager gave the impression of protection to viewers watching at home, a familiar face guiding a newcomer through dangerous territory. Behind the scenes, that protection did little to shield Heidenreich from creative decisions being made above both of their heads. The poetry segments, in particular, drew ridicule rather than intrigue from fans, undercutting the serious, dangerous persona the entire pairing had been built around from the start. By the time the casket match arrived, Heidenreich was already fighting an uphill battle against audience perception, and using his genuine phobia as a storytelling device only added a layer of discomfort that many fans and critics found difficult to watch, even years later. At number 5 is Curtis Axel, a case that shows what happens when Heyman's advocacy exists without any long-term plan behind it at all. Joe Hennig was renamed Curtis Axel in May 2013 and introduced to the world as a Paul Heyman guy, a label that instantly suggested big things were coming for the young performer. Vince McMahon had reportedly promised a serious, sustained push, but within about 3 weeks, Heyman realized there was no actual long-term direction planned for the character in the first place. Axel was a safe, reliable, technically sound wrestler in the ring, but he lacked the natural charisma and speaking ability that usually defines a genuine top-level star in WWE. Heyman used his own considerable talent on the microphone to cover for that gap as best he could, and Axel did manage to capture the Intercontinental Championship during this period of his career. Underneath that title win, though, Axel was mainly being used as protection for Heyman during his personal, high-profile feud with CM Punk, a role that filled an immediate need rather than building toward a genuine long career. Once that feud ended and Brock Lesnar returned to regular television, Axel was quietly phased out of the main event picture almost as fast as he had originally entered it months earlier. The lesson from this case is fairly straightforward once all the pieces are laid out together. Axel was never developed into a complete, self-sufficient star capable of carrying his own storylines. He was a useful tool inside somebody else's ongoing story, valuable to Heyman only for as long as that particular story still needed him around. It is worth pausing on how quickly the entire arrangement unfolded from beginning to end. Axel debuted with the Paul Heyman guy branding, won a championship, served his purpose in the Punk feud, and disappeared from meaningful storylines within roughly a year, a pace that left little room for genuine character development along the way. Fans who had been told this was a can't-miss prospect watched him fade from television almost as suddenly as he had arrived, with no clear explanation offered on screen for the sudden change in direction. Heyman's own comments years later, admitting there had never been a grand design behind the push, confirmed what many observers had already suspected while it was happening. The Intercontinental Championship reign, which should have marked the beginning of a bigger story, instead became the high point of a run that never grew beyond its original narrow purpose. Axel continued wrestling in WWE for several more years afterward, but never again reached the level of prominence that the Paul Heyman guy introduction had originally promised to deliver for him. Looking back, the entire arc reads less like a failed experiment and more like a short-term fix dressed up as a long-term investment. Heyman's speaking ability made that fix look convincing while it lasted, which is precisely the problem this video keeps returning to. A gifted communicator can make almost any pairing sound meaningful for a few months, but sounding meaningful and actually building a career are two very different achievements, and only one of them happened here. At number 4 is Ryback, and this case feels sharper and more personal than most of the others found on this entire list. Ryback joined forces with Heyman in September 2013 to continue Heyman's ongoing feud with CM Punk, a pairing that put both men in a prominent, highly visible spot almost immediately after it was announced. Behind the scenes, WWE reportedly pushed Ryback toward a major championship position before he was technically ready for that level of pressure and scrutiny. Creative leaned on disputed, complicated finishes to protect his undefeated record along the way, rather than letting him earn that reputation through cleaner competition. There were also real safety concerns raised about him during this period by other performers in the locker room. Dolph Ziggler suffered a concussion that some connected directly to working with Ryback inside the ring, and CM Punk has alleged that Ryback's rough style caused him rib injuries that affected the rest of his in-ring career going forward. These points remain reports and accusations rather than settled, proven facts, and they should be treated that way throughout this story. As the feud with Punk continued, Ryback increasingly became a physical shield, absorbing repeated losses that protected Heyman's own storyline rather than building anything lasting of his own. His once dominant, unstoppable image began to fade with every single defeat that followed. Heyman later called him a schmuck during a public interview, openly admitting he never truly believed Ryback would become a lasting major star inside the company. That televised, very public end to their alliance did lasting damage to how fans viewed him for years afterward. This section feels sharper than the Axel case, for a clear reason. Heyman did more than simply fail to elevate Ryback here. He later spoke about that failure in openly dismissive, insulting terms, long after the storyline itself had already ended and Ryback had moved on. The pairing had arrived at a strange moment for both men. Heyman needed a powerful presence to keep his feud with CM Punk relevant, while Punk worked through a demanding creative arc of his own, and Ryback needed exactly the kind of platform Heyman could offer through his connections and his reputation. On paper, the two needs seemed to fit together neatly. In practice, WWE's push moved faster than Ryback's development allowed, and the safety concerns raised by his peers suggested a performer still learning to control his own strength inside a fast-paced, high-stakes environment. When the alliance ended, it did so publicly and without much ceremony, a stark contrast to the momentum that had surrounded Ryback's initial pairing with Heyman only months earlier. The schmuck comment, delivered years later on a podcast, closed the door on any possibility of reconciliation and left little ambiguity about how Heyman genuinely viewed the entire experiment in hindsight, regardless of how it may have looked from the outside, while it was still unfolding on weekly television. Ryback himself has spoken since about feeling used during that period, a claim that fits neatly with everything else uncovered in this particular case. Looking back, the pairing reads less like a genuine investment in a future star, and more like a short-term fix built to solve an immediate creative problem, one that Heyman needed solved quickly, regardless of the long-term cost to the man standing across from him in the ring. At number 3 is Cesaro, a case built around one of the clearest missed opportunities found anywhere on this entire list. Cesaro had just won the very first Andre the Giant Memorial Battle Royal and was riding a genuine wave of crowd support when his alliance with Heyman began the very next night on television. On paper, it looked like a perfect pairing between two natural talents. Heyman was supposed to give Cesaro the speaking power he reportedly lacked, turning raw physical talent into a complete, well-rounded main event package for the first time. Instead, Heyman spent most of his weekly television time discussing Brock Lesnar's plan to end The Undertaker's legendary WrestleMania streak, leaving Cesaro without the spotlight the partnership originally seemed to promise him. Heyman later admitted the arrangement also served a second, more selfish purpose, keeping himself active and visible on television, while Lesnar was away from the show recovering. John Cena reportedly told Vince McMahon backstage in the gorilla position that he believed Cesaro could headline WrestleMania on his own, a remarkably strong endorsement coming from one of the company's biggest and most respected stars. McMahon remained unconvinced despite that support, doubting Cesaro's speaking ability and his mainstream appeal in front of a wider audience. Cesaro began losing matches with growing frequency after that, and a poorly timed heel turn further damaged whatever momentum still remained from his Battle Royal victory months earlier. He eventually returned to the mid-card and to tag team wrestling, a long way down from the main event push so many had expected for him. The criticism here is direct and hard to avoid. Heyman attached himself to Cesaro at the exact moment his career appeared ready to finally take off, then used that partnership mainly to protect his own television time and support somebody else's ongoing storyline instead of building Cesaro's. It helps to walk through the cause and effect chain that led to this outcome. Cena's backstage endorsement should have carried real weight given his standing in the company at the time, yet McMahon's doubts about Cesaro's speaking ability proved stronger than one star's personal recommendation. That skepticism then shaped every decision Heyman made once the partnership began, because Heyman was operating inside a system where satisfying McMahon mattered more than fulfilling the promise fans had seen in Cesaro's Battle Royal win. Talking about Lesnar and the streak gave Heyman a built-in reason to remain relevant on camera without needing McMahon's full confidence in a new, unproven pairing. Cesaro, meanwhile, absorbed the consequences of a plan that was never really designed around him in the first place. His technical skill, widely praised by wrestlers and critics alike, never translated into the kind of sustained push his talent seemed to deserve during this specific period. Years later, Cesaro would find real singles success under a different name and in a different promotion entirely, a fact that only strengthens the argument that the missed opportunity in WWE had little to do with his actual ability inside the ring. The frustration among fans at the time was not quiet either. Chants calling for Cesaro to be given a genuine chance became a recurring feature of WWE crowds for years, a rare instance of the audience openly disagreeing with the direction the promotion had chosen. Heyman, for his part, never publicly criticized Cesaro's ability. His later comments framed the pairing honestly as a missed opportunity shaped by circumstances outside anyone's full control, which is a more generous account than several of the other cases on this list receive, even though the outcome still left Cesaro without the push so many people believed he deserved. At number 2 is Cedric Alexander, whose story unfolds during Heyman's brief time as a backstage executive rather than as an on-screen performing character. When Heyman became executive director of Raw in 2019, he proposed a long-term rebuild centered around younger, more athletic performers, and Alexander was one of the wrestlers specifically chosen to help lead that new direction forward. He received a genuinely meaningful early push under this plan, including an upset win over Drew McIntyre and a string of strong television matches that showed real, tangible promise for his future. Vince McMahon reportedly lost interest quickly regardless, concluding that Alexander lacked the presentation of a true main event level star capable of carrying the brand. Because McMahon held final veto power over every major creative decision made on the show, Heyman ultimately chose to withdraw his support rather than fight a political battle he had very little realistic chance of winning. Alexander was soon handed a heavy, decisive defeat by AJ Styles and slid back down the card almost as quickly as he had originally risen up it. Heyman's proposed rebuild was meant to unfold gradually over 18 to 24 months, a patient timeline that directly conflicted with the company's constant demand for immediate results and strong weekly ratings. That underlying conflict contributed directly to Heyman's own removal from the executive role in 2020, leaving Alexander and several other favored young prospects without the creative backing they had only briefly enjoyed under his plan. It would be unfair to say Heyman never believed in Alexander at all during this period. The more accurate criticism is that his support only lasted for as long as it remained politically affordable inside a system he did not ultimately control himself. The executive director role had given Heyman more formal power than he had ever held in WWE before, and for a brief stretch it looked as though he might finally have the authority to build stars the way he once did in ECW. Alexander's early push carried genuine excitement, the kind that suggested WWE had finally found a fresh direction for a division that many fans felt had grown stale. Ricochet and Humberto Carrillo were meant to rise alongside him, part of the same broader plan Heyman had pitched to McMahon when he took the job. Ratings pressure, however, arrived faster than any rebuild could reasonably work, and McMahon's patience for a slower, more athletic direction ran out within months, rather than the years Heyman had originally requested. Once that patience disappeared, Heyman's position inside the company weakened considerably, and defending Alexander became a fight that offered little upside and real political risk. The decision to step back from him mirrors almost every other case on this list, a pattern of support that depended entirely on convenience, rather than a fixed, personal belief in the performer's long-term future inside the company. At number 1 is the case of Gallows and Anderson, and it stands as the most damaging story on this entire list, because it connects Heyman's public promise of protection directly to an accusation that he privately worked against it behind closed doors. As mentioned earlier, both men were released during WWE's wave of pandemic-related cuts in April 2020, shortly after signing valuable 5-year contracts that should have protected their positions for years to come. Heyman had reportedly assured them personally, face-to-face, that he was fighting internally to keep their spots on Raw completely safe. AJ Styles was not satisfied with that explanation once the releases became public, and he began asking questions of his own throughout the locker room. According to the account behind this video, Styles was told by multiple backstage sources, including Vince McMahon himself, that Gallows and Anderson had not actually appeared on the original list of wrestlers marked for release. Heyman was accused of suggesting their names himself afterward, reportedly because their large, expensive contracts offered an easy way to help the company reach its budget targets during a genuinely difficult financial period. When Styles confronted him about it directly, Heyman denied any responsibility for what had ultimately happened to his friends. Styles did not hold back his anger once he went public, calling Heyman a bold-faced liar and a lying little rat in comments that spread quickly through the entire wrestling world within hours. None of this erases what Heyman has genuinely accomplished across his long career in wrestling. He survived the total financial collapse of his own promotion when almost nobody believed it was still possible. He survived corporate demotions, real locker room anger, and decades of constant industry change inside one of the toughest and most unforgiving businesses in entertainment. It takes a rare kind of instinct to read a room the way Heyman reads one, to know exactly which words will make an ordinary wrestler sound dangerous, and to know exactly when to step back before a losing political fight costs him everything he has built. That same instinct, the one responsible for so many unforgettable moments across 4 decades, is also the instinct behind every retreat cataloged in this video. Survival and loyalty are not always the same skill, and Heyman's career suggests he mastered the first one far more completely than the second. Fans watching him today, standing beside Roman Reigns or whichever star currently benefits from his voice, are watching a man who has spent his entire life learning exactly how far his advocacy can be trusted, and exactly when it quietly runs out. Few people in wrestling history have understood presentation, timing, and psychology anywhere near the way he does. Even after every failed project and every broken bond documented across this video, Paul Heyman's mind for wrestling still stands among the greatest the business has ever seen.